So I now turn to welcoming Emeritus Professor Roy Green, AM FRSN, to deliver his presentation. Roy's AM, his Order of Australia, is newly minted, having been awarded in the 2024 Australia Day Honours List. So congratulations, Roy. Where are you? I've provided a summary of Roy's biography on this slide and leave it to you to read his full credentials on our website. In 2017, Roy was farewelled as Dean of the UTS Business School after 9 years. Apart from his many academic achievements, people single him out for being instrumental in attracting Frank Gehry to design the Dr. Chow Chak Wing building, known, of course, more informally as the Brown Paper Bag building. It stands proudly as the business school at UTS. Roy has many current appointments since his retirement. I think he's probably busier than he was as Dean. He's Special Innovation Advisor to UTS. He's Chair of the Port of Newcastle in the Advanced Robotics Manufacturing Hub. He's a board or council member of CSIRO, the SmartSat CRC and Charles Sturt University. And he's a member of the University of Newcastle's Vice-Chancellor's Industry Advisory Board, the Sydney Economy Advisory Board, and the Australian Design Council. Roy's expertise is in productivity, so who better to enlighten us on the subject, productivity, what it is and why it matters. Welcome, Roy.
Thanks, Susan, and I'd also like to pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of knowledge on this land, and their elders past and present. And thank you for inviting me to give this talk. I do have some slides. There we are. So I'm very glad everyone's here to hear a talk about productivity, and I'm in particular glad that tonight doesn't coincide with an episode of Nemesis on the ABC. The controversies associated with events in that program, of course, are nothing compared with the debates about productivity, as you'll hear. So what is productivity? Well, it's important because it's driven our living standards, growth in living standards since the Industrial Revolution. But, and conceptually, it's not very difficult to define. It's simply output per unit of input. But then the practicalities are more elusive because what is output? At the firm level or at the level of an organisation, you can pretty much define what your output is. But at a national economy level, what does it look like? There's a lot of controversy, of course, in economics about the fact that output is increased when you chop down old growth forests or commit acts of environmental degradation that increase the output of the economy. So it leads to many people trying to devise alternative measures of what productivity should be about. But for better or worse, it's the one we've got. It's GDP. That's the numerator, and the denominator is also quite challenging because originally it was output per person, but with non-standard hours. This was changed by the governments through the OECD and various measurement bodies to hours worked. So the traditional interpretation of productivity when we use it as a comparative measure across countries is output per hour worked. But then the question also arises, where does capital fit in? Because it's both capital and labour that contribute to productivity growth, and it's led to various other versions, broader versions of productivity that are also included in the national accounts, multi-factor productivity, total factor productivity. I won't go into a disquisition about the various interpretations of those forms of productivity. The important thing for us is that we're looking at a trend growth of a particular measure over time. And we're going to focus on Australia for that purpose. And the worrying thing that we find in Australia, even though business groups and financial press and everyone bangs on about it every day, is that our productivity growth has been languishing, and for some years now. Between 2010 and 2020, we have experienced the lowest productivity growth in 60 years at 1.1%. We were sixth for productivity growth in the OECD in 1970, but we're now number 16 in 2020. And this is a sort of counterfactual argument that the Productivity Commission has used. I don't necessarily agree with all of their prescriptions, but they can do some pretty good arithmetic at times. And in this case, they've calculated, what if we'd kept going at 2.2% productivity growth from 1995 to 2023? The calculation is that we would have a real average incomes boost of $25,000 per person. And it would even be more, maybe $3,000 to $5,000 more, had it not been for the fact that in recent years, workers have had a lower share of the productivity gains. That's another story in itself, which is generally described as wage decoupling. So what this has meant is that we are now experiencing what everyone knows, a cost of living crisis. It won't be solved by changing tax policy because it's a much deeper problem than that. It relates to the underlying structure of the economy, which I'm going to spend a bit of time on in this talk. And we need to unpack exactly what that means in the connection that we can draw between productivity growth and the growth of national income, and in this case, real income growth per head. This is a very useful graph. It's a bit busy, but it's a Treasury graph that was devised for the intergenerational report, and it really describes the history of what's been happening over the last 30 years or so. And what we see on the left-hand side is in the 1990s is a big red blotch in that column. And that red blotch is the growth of labour productivity. That's when labour productivity was growing quite fast. It was the period of the Hawke-Keating government economic reforms. What people don't really recognise about those reforms is not that they weren't just about freeing up the capital and labour markets. It was also about the development of a very coherent industrial policy to transition industry from large-scale mass production industries to smaller scale, more specialised SMEs that could find a place in global markets and value chains. It was a complete restructuring of the Australian economy that was going on at that time. And people tend to forget that in the late 1990s, the fastest growing area of world trade for us was elaborately transformed manufactures. Even though a lot of our traditional manufacturing industry had been hit by tariffs, by the tariff removal, nevertheless, new, more specialised, knowledge-based industries were growing at that time because there was a commitment to R&D and to innovation. Things changed in the 2000s. For many people living in this country, the change was quite beneficial because we experienced a massive commodity boom, unprecedented commodity boom, the biggest we'll ever have, most likely in our lifetimes, increasing our standard of living by 15% over a 6-year period without us having to do a thing, because essentially we were getting higher prices for our raw materials, especially iron ore and coal, which we might call the gift from China. It boosted our terms of trade and hence boosted the dollar, but the impact was to make a lot of those new, growing, interesting, specialised firms in manufacturing uncompetitive. We lost about 100,000 manufacturing jobs over an 18-month period. It was a genuine crisis for manufacturing industry, but no one noticed it because everyone was experiencing an increase in their income per head, and life went on without addressing the underlying issues. Other countries have faced that problem as well, other resources-based economies. The most obvious one in the post-war period was Holland, hence the term the Dutch disease, because they discovered North Sea gas, and the price of the guilder went up, and a lot of their manufacturing went to the wall, and it took them about 10 years to restructure their economy to accommodate to the new situation. The next country of note that experienced this phenomenon was the UK during the 1970s and 80s with the discovery of North Sea oil and gas off their coast. And again, the same effect drove up the price of sterling. A lot of manufacturing went to the wall. And after a period of a consumption boom, there was nothing to show for it at the end. It was part of Mrs. Thatcher's economic experiment. She wasn't interested in reconstructing the economy. She was simply interested in ensuring that financial interests got a greater foothold over the national operation of the British economy, and that's exactly what happened with everyone facing crumbling infrastructure, schools, universities, hospitals at the end of the 1980s. And it's people at the time suggested, this is a price that the British will pay for decades, and of course they are. Did we learn from this experience, is the question, in the commodity boom that we experienced in the 2000s? Sadly not. Others did. We had a consumption boom as well, and we've ended up with lower living standards now because the terms of trade boost is gone, and we've experienced also, under all of that, a decline in our productivity growth. Norway is the counterexample because, again, access to North Sea oil and gas. They took a public stake in their major oil company, Statoil. They introduced a resource rent tax. You might recall Kevin Rudd trying to do the same and not being able to do so in the end. But their resource rent tax wasn't the 20 or 30 or 40% that was being proposed in Australia. Theirs was a 76% resource rent tax. And they used that to create what has now become the world's largest sovereign wealth fund, which invests in the future of their economy, in the future of Norwegian generations, building up their research and education infrastructure for many, many decades to come. So that was clever. We missed the chance to do that. And so what we have is a hollowed out economy, as we'll see in a moment, especially with the decline of our manufacturing sector. Getting back to productivity then, because it isn't just this decline of productivity growth isn't just a phenomenon confined to Australia. We are seeing something like it happening across the world. It's just happening more acutely in this country. In the US, Europe, we're also seeing this occurring, and there are various interpretations that have been applied to why this might be the case. One is really, is the last couple of decades so transformative by comparison with what we saw occurring in the late 19th century, early 20th century with indoor plumbing, the telephone, commercial flight, many other developments that we now take for granted, but which were genuinely transformative at the time. Those really provided a huge boost to productivity and hence living standards for those populations. What Bob Gordon and various economists in the US would now say is the internet, what's it ever done for us by comparison with all of these major developments that have changed our lives on previous occasions. Well, he's a bit of an outlier. There's a certain amount of common sense in the argument, but another interpretation is that productivity is just too hard to measure. It's going on, but we can't measure it because so much of what is now produced is intangible, especially with the growth of AI. How do you measure, for example, if a lawyer uses AI for a brief, does that appear in the national productivity statistics? That's going to be a big challenge. But the major interpretation that is occurring and being developed by economists, especially Eric Brynjolfsson and Andrew McAfee at MIT and various scholars in the UK and in the OECD, is that yes, we do have productivity growth, but it's at the technology frontier with smaller cohorts of firms in each country. And your productivity growth on average is defined by the success of that cohort. The problem is that the productivity growth and the technological change that they're experiencing hasn't been diffused or deployed through the economy. That is yet to come, so we have to wait for that. In the meantime, it's this cohort of firms, and you know them all, they're the big tech firms, the really sharp manufacturers that have captured world markets in US, China, Europe. These are the firms that are driving productivity. The issue of how much productivity growth is, what is the proportion of those firms in your economy? And the proportion of those firms in the Australian economy is very small. We have a much larger group of the firms that the OECD would describe as laggards, and very little in the way of institutional structures to deploy the productivity growth and the technology expertise at the frontier to the rest of the firm population. We see that also in some interesting work the Alpha Beta consulting firm did for the federal government a couple of years ago when it analysed the R&D intensity of different sectors, and it was less the R&D intensity of the sectors than the presence of those sectors in the economy that made the difference. So if you have a larger manufacturing sector is the biggest driver of productivity in the economy, you have greater productivity growth in your national statistics. If your manufacturing is hollowed out, well, that's us, then you're highly likely to have a lower rate of productivity growth. So what drives productivity growth in these high productivity, high skill, high value adding firms? And essentially it's technological change and innovation. And it's not always technological. Innovation is also, there can be non-R&D forms of innovation as well, new business models, systems integration, new work and management practices. But generally speaking, technology is what drives it. Technology hasn't been recognized in the traditional neoclassical economic models in the past, but new theories around so-called endogenous growth have made technology the centerpiece of productivity and change and industry transformation in various economies. And what we find, of course, in Australia is that productivity, that R&D for this country has been languishing, along with Canada's. This is Australia, the red line going down the bottom there. Others, Israel, Korea, Japan, have been experiencing massive productivity growth, and that is entirely through their commitment and investment in R&D. In Australia, R&D has been going backwards for some years. We were at about 2.3% a few years ago. We're now scraping the bottom at 1.68%. The government has a target to get to 3% of GDP, but at 1.68%, the question is, what's the roadmap for getting there? In particular, our business expenditure on R&D has fallen behind almost every other country. For Australia, BIRD, as we call it, business expenditure on R&D, is about 50% of R&D generally. In the US, it's 70%. This is partly because we just have a very fragmented research and innovation system. My colleagues and I did a study a few years ago for the government showing that we had research and innovation spending spread across 13 different portfolios of government, 150 different budget line items. Very few have connected with each other. We'd also, by the way, done 60 reports since the Keating-Hawke period on how to improve our R&D system, none of which has had any implementation strategy attached to it. So how do we get to this 3% target? In one sense, it's quite easy because the FTSE has done a calculation together with Universities Australia in which they find that $1 of R&D creates or adds $3.50 to the economy overall. So if we spent $4.4 billion per annum up to 2035, we would get to 3%. And it would also add 133 billion per year to our economy. So why don't we do that? $4.4 billion a year is not all that much. And you might want to compare that with how much we spend, for example, on the diesel fuel tax rebate. That's $7.9 billion a year for a handful of international mining companies to drive diesel trucks across their mining sites. So wouldn't it be smart to start spending that money or finding the resources to allocate to R&D instead and contribute to the future of this economy? Well, we could do that, but the problem is even deeper, unfortunately, than simply R&D. It goes to our narrow trade and industrial structure. And this is a very interesting exercise that some of you may be familiar with, the Harvard Atlas of Economic Complexity. It's an annual report that's done to show the economic complexity or otherwise of 130 or so economies around the world. Economic complexity measures the diversity and research intensity of the export mix. And so I'll show you a couple of examples. Germany, number 4. As you can see, a lot of the blue area, which predominates in the German export mix, is around machinery. The pink part also around medtech and pharma and cars and car parts, ICT. You can see this is a highly complex economy and it is very largely driven by advanced manufacturing. Canada is a bit more comparable with us, another resources economy, also languishing in this ranking, but as you can see, predominance of raw material exports, but also a fair sprinkling of complex activities as well, value adding within manufacturing, particularly in the automotive industry. When we look at ourselves, we're now number 93. We used to be around 50 in the 1990s. We're now number 93. And you can see what dominates our export mix. The Productivity Commission thinks this is absolutely fine because we have a comparative advantage in unprocessed raw materials. But we only have to imagine if this piece disappeared overnight, if the Chinese decided not to buy our iron ore, we would have a big gap in our export mix to fill, and that those export values are what enables us to import all the complex stuff that we don't manufacture or build. Here's an indication of the degree to which we've slid down these rankings. Australia, also Canada to some degree, but look at what's happening to the rest of the world economy, or at least the examples I've selected. The East Asian countries have really begun to dominate these rankings, and even Vietnam has managed to pull itself up into, if not a first world country, then well on the way to being a technological powerhouse. but we still have an issue around this trade and industrial structure, which is kind of exemplified in a vaguely amusing way by this Economist article a couple of weeks ago, which asked the question, what if Australia and Canada were one country? And we called it AusAnada. And it would be an economy almost as big as Germany's, but based almost entirely on the export of raw materials, but lagging far behind other comparable countries in terms of its high-tech exports, representing 7% of the combined exports of OECD countries, but only 4% for Canada and less than 2% for Australia. So this article concludes, this is not for want of well-nourished brains. AusAnada is home to world-class universities and boasts some of the highest rates of tertiary education. Rather, the problem is an underfed innovation system. It's not as though we didn't know this, and we've known it for a very long time. I'm reminded always of the science and technology budget statement in 1993, issued by Treasury, which said, "Our most urgent task is to build an innovative culture in industry. Above all, we need a cultural change among business leaders, decision makers, and the community generally, which recognises the major significance of innovation that innovation has for building national competitiveness. A clear sense of direction, planning, leadership are needed to achieve our goals." Well, we have a long way to go, and it isn't just a question of market failure. It's a massive systems failure across our economy and in our institutional structures. It's also been reflected in another index that was devised by an American think tank across the world, looking at the presence of advanced industries in each country. And if we say the average is 1, then in 1995 we were 0.56, so quite well behind the average. In 2018 it's 0.41, and we've dropped almost to the bottom of the 74 country index. By advanced industries, here we mean medtech, pharma, electronics and IT, machinery. And it's also meant that we've dropped down every other ranking, the IMD competitiveness ranking, etc. A recent finding was that 98% of our companies, 98% do not produce new to the world innovation. 2% do. So let's unpack that a little bit by looking at the latest Global Innovation Index rankings. We can see who's at the top of those. We're at number 24. So you might not think that's too bad, but when we drill down, we can see what the problems are. In terms of what we do well, we're pretty good at innovation inputs. It's the innovation outputs that are the problem. Innovation inputs, tertiary enrolment, we're right up there. Females with degrees, our university rankings, scientific articles, which essentially drive the rankings, and our use of ICT. What we're not so good at, as we saw earlier, our expenditure on R&D, the translation of that research into commercial value through industry, university-industry collaboration, cluster development, the development of areas of specialisation that can achieve critical mass in global markets and value chains. Our education expenditure, we think we spend quite a lot, but we don't compared with other countries. And if we took that number and made it public expenditure per pupil, we go out to about number 60. And entrepreneurship policies and culture, we're improving, but we're still not up there. Our outputs of innovation, what we do with the inputs lags far behind all the other OECD countries. And let's look at that just a bit more by returning to R&D and our expenditure on that. This is a growth index. And what we see there in the orange and yellow bars are government and business expenditure, the growth of government and business expenditure on R&D. It's not going anywhere, in fact, going down. What's going up is higher education R&D. It's universities, in fact, that are doing the heavy lifting now for Australia's R&D effort, which is good in a sense, but not for the best of reasons, because this is only occurring because we're attracting large numbers of international students whose fees are then diverted to filling the gap that would otherwise be filled in other countries by public expenditure on our research and innovation. And by diverting that money to research, we increase our rankings and attract more international students, and we continue on this very precarious hamster wheel. And it's not necessarily producing the research that we need as a country. A lot of it is medical research, which is good, but the sort of research that's also needed in industry is science and engineering, business, and that's the research that we're not necessarily funding. And more than that, the research isn't necessarily breakthrough research, because it isn't just research that will change the game here. There was a very interesting piece of work a little while ago published in Nature on research productivity. Why are we getting less and less breakthroughs in research? Is research becoming too incremental? And the authors looked at 45 million published articles across the world using an AI tool with various keywords to determine which were the breakthrough research pieces that would change the citation structure, etc., of future authors who may draw upon that work. Found that over a long period of time since the Second World War, we've seen a massive decline in breakthrough research and research becoming more incremental. And why is that occurring? Because research itself is becoming narrower and narrower in each of our disciplines and sub-disciplines. And so we're missing the sparks of creativity that occur at the intersections of disciplines. It's another story, but it is something that's not just peculiar to Australia, but a global phenomenon. So you saw some bad news on the previous slide. This is where it gets even worse, because this now looks at our domestic industry diversification. We looked at the export diversification with the Harvard Complexity Index. This is our domestic diversification lagging at 40 out of the various countries surveyed. High-tech exports, which are part of that. ICT access, essentially reflecting the botched national broadband introduction. Graduates in science and engineering, lagging. We are short of 50,000 engineers in Australia. Where are they going to come from? We only produce 13,000 a year. And all culminating in this poor record of our labour productivity growth. Let's end with finding out what we can do about it, because it's all possible to undertake policies that are transformational in this country should governments at every level decide to do so. You might ask, why is it so hard to make those decisions? Maybe we can have a discussion about that. But the federal government has sorted out its priorities, especially with the National Reconstruction Fund. Renewable technologies, transport, value-adding and agricultural resources, defence and aerospace, enabling capabilities around new technologies. All of these are good. The question is, what does the implementation strategy look like? Equally, with New South Wales, the new government has, with Annalek Chantavong as the Minister identified some areas where we will devise missions, we will have enabling technologies, we will have various sectors that we drill down into. We're very good at doing these things, but where is the implementation strategy? The Minister is having an innovation blueprint summit on Friday, so we might find out more about that. But let's ask ourselves, since we've missed so many opportunities up till now, where can we play as a country? And Ross Garnaut has made the argument, and I think in a very compelling way, for Australia to be a renewable energy superpower. We're very fortunate to have been given another chance as a country. This is Nicholas Stern, who did the Stern Review on the Economics of Climate Change a few years ago. This is the area that is the fastest growing sector in the world for productivity growth. It will be a $10 trillion sector by 2050. Already, the investments are way outstripping fossil fuels. It's a tremendous way to increase productivity and restore our manufacturing capability, because we can now use the immense resources of wind and solar to produce the electrons, either directly or through hydrogen and its various components, to create and new industries and transform existing ones with green iron and green steel, green aluminium. Europe is about to introduce a border adjustment mechanism which will penalise supply chains that are not low carbon. We can do low carbon manufacturing activities here and become a manufacturing exporter. If we get all of these things right in the and in a framework that does it coherently, which we currently don't have, and I'll end on this slide because this is essentially what I think is missing here. A coherent, coordinated innovation ecosystem that might look something like this, and which is in fact what you might find in most other countries that do have a high level of productivity and presence of advanced industries. Mission-led industrial policy. What are the problems we're trying to solve? How do we turn those into missions, national missions for the country, and put our resources behind those missions? It starts with technology foresighting. Where are the areas of current and future competitive advantage as opposed to simply comparative advantage? Comparative advantage is about our resources. Competitive advantage is about our knowledge and ingenuity. How do we identify those rather than just list priorities? What are the issues that we can and problems we can solve? Research and technology development. Let's certainly not miss the opportunity to put extra public resources into research and technology development, including basic research, because basic research has declined as a proportion of our research spending. If you don't have basic research, you won't have anything to commercialise, and that connects then with the applied research that we do in CRCs, in CSIRO, in other places, which could then be mobilised around these missions. Place-based innovation ecosystems is really what is happening around the world to promote research and development, but also to create new industries. The Fraunhofer Institutes are probably the best example in Germany. The British picked this up with their catapult centres, especially the high-value manufacturing catapults. The US is now doubling down on this approach in the Biden legislation with the CHIPS and Science Act. They're creating National Science Foundation regional innovation engines and something called the Microelectronics Commons, which are the technology hubs around the US. An immense amount of money being spent on each one, $200 million per ecosystem or hub. And these are characterised by their ability to bring together universities, research institutions, industry, especially large anchor companies, and government funding in a collaborative way to not just do a linear pipeline from an idea to a commercial outcome, which is the traditional way of understanding commercialisation, but through the interaction of multiple disciplines and individuals and institutions to devise programs and industrial applications that no one might have thought of before those interactions take place. A good example with the catapults is the Formula One catapult. They started working on, they thought, our car industry is gone now, so we'll at least work on Formula One cars, which we're pretty good at. And out of the design of new precision pit stop engineering, they designed new ways of running operating theatres in hospitals, which then became a new export industry for Britain. These are the sort of things that happen at the intersection of disciplines. Public sector as an innovation driver. Again, the US does this very well with the so-called SBIR, the Small Business Innovation Research Program. Each department is compelled, it's not voluntary, they are compelled to set aside a certain percentage of their funds to enable SME technology growth to solve the problems and meet the needs of those public sector institutions, especially in the health system. Some would say that's the most important innovation program in the US, along with DARPA and a few others, but it's certainly been transformative for technology, taking them to the leading edge. We could do that here. Nothing to stop us from making sure that if we do procurement in certain areas, we don't do this crazy treasury value for money thing, which means that we buy Chinese trains or Korean trains that don't fit on the tracks, or ferries that don't fit under bridges. Why wouldn't we do that properly ourselves? Skills and capability building, obviously, that's essential here. For example, if we go into offshore wind, as we're intending to do, we have a massive opportunity, for example, in Newcastle, Port of Newcastle is playing a role in this, to do several gigawatts of power out of the proposed offshore wind facility. The company that's currently the front runner, I guess, for allocation of the tender has set out it's a Norwegian company, of course, set out its vision of what this would look like. And part of its vision is they would build the platforms here onshore. But they've said to the government, by the way, if we're going to do that, we need 4,000 welders on day one. Where are they going to come from? So those are the challenges, I think, that we face, and all of them solvable, I think. But we do need a vision of what the system can look like that draws on the best examples from around the world and then designs it in a way that works for this country. Thank you very much. Happy to have a discussion.
You mentioned in skills and capability building the apparent shortage of welders, and you talked in one of the previous slides about the low level, comparatively, of technology graduates, and that led me to think about STEM. And I wondered whether it was a problem with the number of graduates, leaving aside the welders, the number of graduates in STEM subjects, because it didn't seem to me that there was a great demand for them at the moment. There might be in certain directions if we move in that way, but I'm wondering what you might have to say about the problem of graduates in the STEM subjects.
Yeah. Oh, well, there is a shortage of graduates in specific areas. especially in relation to large projects in construction industry. Where we need to build further demand, of course, is in manufacturing. And at the moment, there are manufacturers who are trying to grow and can't find enough graduates to fill their positions, and are putting pressure on the government to loosen, the immigration rules around work visas, and that's happening at the moment. So we will draw a lot of our potential graduates from abroad, but overall, until it's a sort of chicken and egg thing, but until we grow our manufacturing again and do so in advanced technologies, there will be a lot of students at university or even at high school who will wonder, is there a future for me if I do STEM subjects? Where would I work?
Yeah, thanks very much for that. There's a wonderful example of the place-based innovation ecosystems from the 50s, and it was summarised in a really good book called The Ideas Factory, which described the success of Bell Labs, where they invested a huge amount of money and hired scientists and told them just to go for it, and not measuring what they did, not giving any instructions. And there was an economic analysis of this, and the value add was just fantastic. So it does work, but there's got to be some innovation and drive to do it.
Yeah, that's a really interesting area. Those large labs, Bell Labs, IBM, they were the drivers of a lot of innovation. In fact, most of the patents at that time came from those labs, not from universities. And the question people ask is, why did those labs disappear? Why did they decline and disappear? Because those companies began to outsource all of their research and development activities. And one of the reasons that has been given, which is an interesting one, is the weakening of antitrust legislation in the United States. Because while antitrust existed, those companies couldn't just buy other companies and take their ideas, which is what's happening now. They had to develop everything within their own organisations, hence the development of their own labs. Now, if you're a very large company in the US, and the big tech companies are the obvious example of this, if you see an innovation going on in a startup or even something a bit larger, like Facebook taking over WhatsApp, you just buy it. And obviously Facebook and Google and so on are doing a lot of R&D themselves as well, but it certainly ensures that they can consolidate their position without doing everything themselves or being in competition with anyone.
Thank you for your wonderful talk. I wonder if I could ask two questions. One, could you comment on the impact on all of this by the corporatisation of universities? And as a side to that, would you have a comment on the fact that the next Vice-Chancellor of ANU is Genevieve Bell? The second question is, does the different social environment of Scandinavian countries have an impact on all the kind of stuff you've been talking about, having in mind that generally in global economic statistics, Scandinavian countries are well in advance of Australia?
Yeah,
Thank you.
I'll answer the second one first. A lot easier than the first one. Absolutely. So the Scandinavian countries have not only an innovation system, but they also have a social system which supports it. So if you want to take the risk of undertaking startup activity and you fail, you have a social safety net. And that gives people a great deal of security about pursuing R&D activities or entrepreneurial activities that you might not have in a more deregulated economy. They also put a huge amount of their own resources, public resources, because they pay more tax into R&D. And so, if you're paying, the top rate of tax is 60 or 70%, then you can get a lot of public expenditure out of that that is then used to pursue both social and economic ends. Hence, those countries have the highest productivity growth in the world, as well as having the highest rating on the happiness index. As for universities, I'm not quite sure where they fit on the happiness index these days. But yes, there's a certain amount of corporatisation that's occurred since the Dawkins reforms. I remember in my university at the time, we were looking at this and asking ourselves, what did it mean? And what it meant very quickly was that the Vice-Chancellor wasn't an advocate for us in government. He became the advocate of the government in our university. I think that pretty much summed up what's happened since. Obviously, still a lot of scope for universities and academics to do the things that they're good at, but I can't imagine anyone's not noticed the huge rise in bureaucracy and form filling and all the rest that has occurred that makes life very challenging. But I don't have to do that anymore.
Hi, Roy. Thanks very much for your talk. Very interesting. One of the underlying themes in your talk was the fact that manufacturing industry is much more innovative than the service sector. And thanks to the way that our exchange rate has helped the exports of raw materials have helped the interest exchange rate and hence affected the manufacturing sector. So I don't see how we can change that system, because at the moment we still think it's very important to export rocks and what the other expression was, I forgot nowadays. And I think the whole policy we still follow, it seems to be that we must export more of our minerals and that's going to help our society in the future. How are we going to change that?
Yeah, well, that's the question, $64 billion question. The Productivity Commission would say we don't need to change it because we're good at exporting rocks. And what a thrill it was when we found that batteries were made of lithium, because it meant that we could continue exporting raw materials, and now lithium will take over from iron ore and be the next big commodity boom. Well, that didn't go so well. Lithium is oversupplied now in the world economy and its price has dropped dramatically. But even if it hadn't, wouldn't it be smart for us to move into the whole value chain of battery production, energy storage, personal mobility, as Canada is in fact trying to do itself. But right now, when it comes to lithium, we export 90% of it, 90%, most of it to China. We produce 50% of the world's lithium, by the way, export 90% to China, and we capture 0.53% of its final value, 0.53%. And so when the AUKUS arrangements suggest to us how wonderful it will be to be incorporated into the Defence Production Act, the question we should be asking is not how much raw lithium can we sell you, but do we have the opportunity in that arrangement to move up the value chain?
Okay, the next question's there. Then we go front row, Susan, Maria, and it was and Don. Okay.
Hi, you mentioned the importance of generating research that upon implementation maximizes the productivity of all other sectors of the economy. Could research productivity be improved through adopting a collaborative approach across all portfolios during the translation of research?
Do you mean across government portfolios or disciplines?
Not just government portfolios, but also across various faculties within universities as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, certainly at the government level, it's with limited resources, it doesn't make any sense for us to have a defence research strategy, an energy research strategy, a health research strategy, and something around industry, departments of industry and education. There should be a single strategy around industrial transformation and social well-being, and all of these elements can feed in because there's so many potential crossover points and points of intersection between the disciplines. But that sort of siloed thinking mirrors exactly how we operate our universities, because with the focus on top-tier peer-reviewed publications, which are increasingly narrow, everybody's incentive is to publish in those journals, not to work with someone in a different discipline, except, you know, there's a few oddballs around who might like to do that, probably some of them in this room. But it won't give you any promotion, won't stand you in any good stead if you're a young aspiring researcher in a university. Won't give you the sort of promotion opportunities you would have if you didn't sort of double down on the narrowest possible subdiscipline area and publish in the top journal in that area that may not ever have any further application or even have a very wide readership. So I think universities need to push against the ranking exercise that forces them to do this. How many German universities are there in the rankings? Not all that many. They've made a conscious decision that it's more important to connect research to the future of their economies and societies rather than simply chase rankings for their own sake. And the same goes, I've noticed, in business schools in Germany with their complete disregard for MBAs. They have very interdisciplinary Masters of Management programs that bring together engineers, designers, or social scientists, all sorts of interesting people, and that plays into the whole Fraunhofer system as well. So there are different ways of doing this. We just don't do it.
Thank you very much, Roy. Linwood, you're absolutely right about the inputs. The most recent index of creativity showed that Australia is the most creative country in the world, but we rate very poorly on innovation, exactly as you say. And we obviously need a mission-led industrial strategy. So thanks for promoting it. We see all the problems. Just in terms of an opportunity, I'm just really wondering, what do you think about opportunities from AUKUS, given that the US and the UK will be sharing IP with us?
If the submarines appear by 2050, I'll be very surprised. And the more money we spend on refurbishing American shipyards is money we won't be spending on our own R&D. So I guess I'm not very favourable to that way of thinking. Maybe there will be some opportunities, but I think they've been overblown because politicians like to give the impression that it's going to be nirvana for Australian industry. But as I said before, it will be for very specific areas of Australian industry. There might be some small defence companies or space companies that get picked off by American primes. We might lose them. We are losing them as we speak. I would put a lot more emphasis on sovereign capability, even though it's the rhetoric of governments now, but we don't actually do it. And I'd be very concerned if we lose a lot of the important research collaboration opportunities that we have with other countries because we're putting all our eggs in that basket.
Okay, we've got three more questions. Susan, off you go.
Roy, a lot of this is deja vu. We've been hearing about the issues in the Australian innovation system for a long time, and you've got mission-led industrial policy up the top. The problem is it changes every 3 years. So how do we overcome the lack of continuity in our thinking, or how do other countries overcome that?
Yes, well, you have continuity if you insist on it, and other countries do. If the government changes in the Netherlands, which it's currently doing, or in Finland or Ireland or other places like that, the whole corpus of R&D policy is not overthrown. The next government will maybe tweak it or develop it in different ways, but it will continue. The institutions continue. The key personnel in the departments continue, and there is continuity. In Australia and to some extent in the UK, even more so now in the US, government changes and everyone has to change their positioning as well. Certainly in this country, we do have missions in CSIRO. We have priorities, we have challenges, we have all sorts of schemes that are inconsistent with each other across the institutions of government, CSIRO, universities, and the Science and Technology Council. As soon as we clean that up and say, here are the 5 things we're going to do, and we're going to do them really well, and we're going to pull all the resources in to make it happen, we'll be in this very fragmented environment where another government could be elected next year or 3 years' time, and it all changes. One of the examples that always strikes me is with the Hawke-Keating government, a number of excellent programs were developed in the industrial policy space, especially a program, people don't even remember now, called the National Industry Extension Service, NICE, which was a cooperative federal and state government program. No one knew where the money came from. It came from all sorts of places that were cooperating to ensure that it happened. And it was all about capability building in enterprises and the development of their innovation capacity and their innovation absorptive capacity, because we're not going to do all the R&D here. We do 2% of the world's R&D. Most of it we will bring in from elsewhere. And so enterprise absorptive capacity is a really important thing. Are your companies able to adapt, adopt, and absorb technology and implement it to improve productivity? And that program, 1996, Howard government elected, gone.
We might move to Maria.
Roy, that was a tremendous presentation, as always. The question on skills and capability, I'm sitting next to the CEO of advance.org, who looks after 1 million Australians living and working overseas. We export all this talent, and yet when they come home, we give them short shrift, ignore them. They either come home to retire or they come home to educate their children, and given everything you've described, they leave again. How do we change that dynamic so that they can come home and be the entrepreneurs and lead the companies and bring the innovative thinking and stay?
Well, it's not hard. Mainly having the infrastructure and the money is what it's about. The Irish did this extremely well because they decided in the 1980s they were going to be an innovation economy. Everyone knows the story. They were had 17% unemployment, inflation, economy going nowhere, and some civil servants, together with research institutions, decided this is the moment when we introduce policies that will transform our economy forever. So they introduced a foreign direct investment attraction agency, especially focused on R&D intensive FDI. How well do we do that? We don't. They introduced Enterprise Ireland, which builds up the capability of local businesses to become part of the supply chains of these large companies that were then attracted. They built a skills agency. And then the big piece of the puzzle was Science Foundation Ireland, which devised policies and programs in conjunction with the universities and large companies that attracted back all the clever Irish people that had left and had senior positions in American and European universities. And they said, how much will it take for you to run in the university? As I was associated with the Regenerative Medicine Institute. How much will it take? €1 million, €1.5 million, whatever it is, we want to bring you back, plus bring a few Germans and Californians as we go. And that's what they did. And in a 10-year period, the economy was transformed, highest GDP per head in Europe, next to Luxembourg, and high-tech exports.
Some ups and downs since then. Don, can you make yours one sentence?
More or less. Roy, I don't want to sort of end on a pessimistic note, and I would love to see a policy like that, architecture like that implemented, and I think you mounted such a coherent argument, but I must admit to being profoundly depressed. I think Australian business has a culture of rent-seeking that has been in place ever since the country existed. They have governments of both persuasions totally under their thumb. We see it reflected in competition policy. I mean, the recent stuff around the airline industries.
That's a very long sentence.
Yes, it is, and I'll finish it. If you look back in history, what really transforms countries is a catastrophe. The Civil War in Britain, the Civil War in the United States, the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution in China, the destruction of the two world wars in Japan and Germany, that's what leads to this sort of transformation. I don't know what the catastrophe has to be to shake Australia out of its complacency, but it will happen. I hope it doesn't happen with great effect, but it could well be something like climate change. But unless we come to grips with those issues, then I don't think that we will make progress in these areas because no one really is interested.
Roy?
Maybe that would be a good topic for a forum.
Yeah, I think we'll leave that one. Roy, I won't ask you to answer that because I want to say thank you and then we must close this meeting while we have to be out there. We're very, yes, indeed. Look, I think that we've been incredibly lucky to have Roy talking tonight about productivity. In fact, I was struck looking at Susan's slide of what you're doing now as a retiree, that you're a sort of personification of productivity. We can see what the hours worked must be as the denominator. What about the numerator? What is the numerator up there about what you're producing? And it really did hit me that we have some good examples around, Don. I think that description of that very sad move from the Hawke-Keating years where we opened up to market forces, the WTO, we were using the market to push the productivity forward. And then we've got into this, and I know, apart from everything else, he does pieces for the Fin Review, which I've been reading, which are quite often a lot sharper than he was tonight, and about some of the failures of government. But we have had a very failed process over the last few years. And it is being challenged, isn't it? I mean, the whole geopolitical situation is making things very difficult. And your description of the way that we have to go about rethinking that big numerator of GDP and break it up into these complexities of industries, I think has been really important and very, very clearly put, very cogently argued for what seems to me a really large amount of government intervention. And I think that you've been working through your life developing this innovation ecosystem, and you have at least, there was a certain degree of, which is why I was cross when you were being depressed, Don Hector. I thought there was at the end a certain degree of hope that it could happen, that we could get it right. And I think you're very influential in government as well. Perhaps we can hope for the best. So thank you very much. Now I'll hand to Susan to close the